and answer this question once and for all as we walk through this. What is a civil death? Okay. Punishment disability statutes are what droplets of water are to a river. They're rushing streams of never-ending punishments causing poverty, crime, and unrest. It's a civil death. We're telling people to put time limits on these statutes because we already know that their statutes are coming in. Remember, if you haven't been to the seminars, you may not know this yet, but I'll tell you again, just so you know, if you're just joining us and just learning, but we know that the criminal justice system replaced the African system, but now there are more white slaves than blacks, because remember, we know that to be a convicted felon means that you are in fact a slave, because the criminal justice system is the exception, again, to the rule against slavery. So having understood that, and if you haven't been to the summits, then you got to go to them, you got to get one. But once you understand that, then what is our solution? The Jubilee process for Kingdom Litigators, these seminars, the Jubilee process, we are looking and we're trying to remedy the issue of what we call a civil death. So when these punishment statutes, which are like droplets of water, come rushing in, they create over time rivers of never-ending punishments, and this leads to poverty. It leads to crime. It's going to lead to unrest. And when we say crime, we mean that there was a study done by Harvard in 2020, and the study specifically found that those who had their records clear, the recidivism rate was 0.06%. What are we talking about? Have you ever imagined someone getting a pardon and then going out to say, "Ooh, I'm going to commit another crime"? I just got my record clear. I just went through a pardon process and turned my life around, and to celebrate, I'm going to go rob 15 people. No. They're going to try and do it again and do it right. Anybody who gets out of the criminal justice slavery system is not trying to go back once you clear their record. Try clearing their record. I guarantee you your crime problem will become obsolete overnight. You'll start seeing decrease in your recidivism rates and people going in and out the prison system almost immediately. Put time limits on it. So what are we talking about? If you've already been following us, you know we're talking about the freedom suits, 21st century freedom suits. What are we saying? We're saying Jubilee process coaching is best for those who are going to jail, who are currently looking at going into jail, who are in jail, and who are leaving jail, because you need to find your purpose. Start now looking for your pathway to freedom. Don't wait until after you get out of jail or after you've gone through the system to start looking for your pathway to freedom. Start today. Start right now. Even if you have not even been convicted, start now. Stop what you're doing and just go get on the right path. Go back to church and ask if they have a Jubilee process ministry there. And for those who are already out of jail, who've already out of their sentence, whether it's prison sentence, whether you are now gone from your whatever probation or community service, remember your time under supervision, you are no longer physically restrained by the state, but yet you still have this criminal record. How do you then become free? We're going to help you during these Jubilee process seminars and around the country coming up. We're going to fight for yourself, freedom suits. You know, it wasn't until around 2008 in St. Louis where they found over 300 cases where slaves had successfully fought for their freedom. The Freedom Suits Museum, go look it up. And during this time, these slaves would go into Missouri and actually fight for their own freedom. Now, these slaves weren't super educated. They weren't lawyers. They weren't well-read. They barely had 8th and 9th grade educations, if they had any education at all. But what made them good literate? All of the cases they found, just in 2008 in St. Louis from the old courthouse, they were successful. Why? Because fighting for your freedom doesn't have an end date. You can't lose fighting for your freedom because you come right back. So Freedom Suits is all about getting you ready. You don't need a lawyer. We're not here to tell you to go get a lawyer. I'm here to say, first, pick yourself up and go fight for yourself, because we have a history of winning those fights for our freedom. And if You just happen to not be successful. That's where you can call one of us, each one free one, and our kingdom litigators will come in and our colleagues will come in and we'll help you. And we're, to be honest with you, undefeated. We have not lost because we will not quit. We are not going to stop fighting for your freedom. So just because they say no today doesn't mean that's no tomorrow. We just know there's one way we can't get it done. We'll come right back. So I want you to take note that there is no such thing as failure. You're not going to not be free. So if you start down this path, just know you're going to finish it. How did we make the connection? And I want to make sure that before you go, you're very educated. How did we make the connection from the slavery system to now suggesting in the middle of the Jubilee process, in the middle of all these things we have going on, why then do we say put time limits on it? Because the criminal justice system, remember, is the exception to the slavery rule, which means it's now subject to the 8th Amendment. And what does the 8th Amendment say? Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fine imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. What are we talking about here? We're talking about, in Graham versus Florida, there was a case that came out where the Supreme Court said that a juvenile could not be given life without parole for a non-homicide offense. What are we talking about? We're talking about time. There's two classes of cases that the Supreme Court has always recognized in terms of looking at cruel and unusual punishments, and they're always talking about looking at whether or not the crime is proportionate to the sentence or the sentence is proportionate to the crime. That means we're looking at your time limits. How long are you being punished for? When we look at most of the barriers that that affect convicts these days or people who've been justice impacted, we see that there are no time limits for the civil disability statutes. So we have an issue right there. We are talking about putting time limits on these things. We don't need to pontificate on the 8th Amendment. I don't need to go into deep theological and legal philosophical debate on the efficacy and morals of whether or not we should have a slave society or whether or not the sex offender or the murderer should be allowed to work near you or live near you. We're not saying that. There's no reason for us to have this long debate. There's no time limits on it. I don't know if 50 years is enough. I don't know if 100 years is enough. Or 20 years is enough for someone who's convicted of a drug felony not to live next to you or be able to obtain SNAP benefits. I'm not sure that if 50 to 20 years is enough time for him to show himself rehabilitated. What I am saying, though, is put time limits on it because it's subject to the 8th Amendment. And forever is a long time. That's what we call a civil death. What do we call a civil death? And this is something that I wanted to get on today and to just walk through one more time so everyone would understand. This isn't a new concept. This is not something that we have just come up with out of thin air. The Supreme Court's already described this. In 2019, the Commission on Civil Rights under President Trump has already declared and explained what a civil death was. This wasn't something that Dan came up with on his own. And I wanted to show you that in the slaughterhouse cases, they've already made these connections. Slavery, I want you to look at this. Slavery in the annals of the world had been the ultimate solution of controversies between the creditor and the debtor, the conqueror and his captive, the father and his child, the state and an offender against its laws. But what we're talking about is making sure that the laws don't enslave a man to the soil. Because even in the 1800s, they already knew that the slaves and former slaves were subject to laws that were essentially created so that they could not progress in society. So when you're talking about civil death, you're talking about laws designed to enslave a man to the soil. We're not saying that people should, if you are convicted of a crime, you should be right next to someone. No, there may be a period of time where we feel comfortable for your rehabilitation, but you will find him rehabilitated at some point. Because right now we have a very serious issue in this country where we have a lot of people going into the system, a lot of people coming out of incarceration in jail, but no one's becoming free. So the number of folks is going up, but the number of people coming out is getting ready. It's exploding. It's imploding. So what do we have to do? Put time limits on it. And immediately you'll see some people have already waited 50 years for their freedom. They will be free the very next day. Putting time limits on statutes for barriers to housing, barriers to employment, barriers to loans and financial products, barriers to professional licenses, and barriers that affect education. We just need time limits on them. Because if these individuals cannot obtain freedom from the governors, which we are working through that now, if they cannot get that, then the only other way they can be free is if they finish whatever process that you believe is necessary for them to show themselves rehabilitated. Put time limits on it. And without time limits, you're going to violate the 8th Amendment. That's our problem. We're going to go in and we're going to fix that problem. In the meantime, in between time, it's time for you to get up to go fight for yourself. Do not allow yourself and your loved ones to continue in the path that they have been going. If they are experiencing civil death, it's time for them to take control of that situation and wake themselves up and go fight for their own freedom so that they're not civilly dead. This is not a new concept. Poverty, crime are on the rise, and it's all stemming around individuals' inability to make it past their current their current situation, which includes their past record. The laws have to have time limits on them. And until we're able to understand what time limits are appropriate for whatever crimes you think are require them, remind you that God did say just turn the other cheek. But if you're not going to do that, then you need to put time limits on whatever system of justice you come up with. So what are we suggesting? This is our solution. This is the solution to the criminal justice issue in this country, is to first go get your pardon, gear your mind towards freedom first. There's no point in getting expungements. There's no point in getting sealments if you're not going to be free in the end. If you're going to do the work that's required for an expungement and sealment, you might as well start with the pardon and then work your way down. You can't stay slaves to the system through the criminal justice. And in that event, we got to put time limits and you got to fight for your freedom. Go find your purpose. Right now, I put this out there, and it's a little bit, we did it a little bit without being rehearsed. So I thank everyone for just being a part of this, for listening. As we finish our Jubilee Process seminars throughout this month, this is going to be the new time where we're going to go next to churches, and we're going to travel around the country. We're going to try to educate everyone. We're going to reignite the church, which is our goal. We don't want you come to us necessarily. We want you going to church. Go to your local church. And if you don't go to church, now's a good time to go back, because we want something set in place permanently that allows us to make sure that individuals find their purpose the best way we know how, that we understand that they at least tried to get their lives back together, and we're going to do our part. If the church does its part, we'll do our part, and we need every one of you. If you're affected by a civil death, if you know someone who's affected by a civil death, we're asking that you go right now, find out where your local church is, and and I do want to say this because we're live, and so I can. If you've had bad experiences in church and you're somehow jaded about the process, I want to stop you right there and tell you that the church ain't God. And I know that might come as a shocker to some people, but they're not God. But he still loves the church, even if you feel they have hurt you. It's still the best place to go for what is coming in this country, for the issues that are coming in this country. You need something. If it's time to turn your life around, you need hope. You need a new chance. I've had a vision, and this is now completely off. We're completely off the off of our schedule, but I want to share this.